A lot of people have been confused about the potential hostage and truce deal between Israel and Hamas. In the following video, I'm going to break down what has been published about the deal, what we know the plans are, and where the big question marks still remain. I'm Alon Burstein. Let's dive in. The current negotiations between Israel and Hamas are rumored to be in their absolute final stages, with some reports suggesting that a deal may be agreed upon in the coming hours or days. But it's important to note that despite these advances, a near complete media blackout of the details of the deal has been strictly imposed by the different negotiating parties, leaving many people with questions about what the deal actually includes. Is this just a temporary hostage deal? Is it a final end to the war? What is included? What I'm going to do here is discuss what has been published with regards to the deal and where this matches the previous negotiation rounds between the sides. I'll also talk about where the sides have seemingly compromised, and we'll also discuss what are some of the sticking points that have seemingly not been resolved, at least with regards to what has been published. The current deal is modeled after the previous negotiation rounds and proposals of May and July of 2024. In fact, what has happened is they said we took that deal and made some adjustments and compromises. Both sides have seemingly made compromises on some of the sticking points that led negotiations to break down over the past year. However, some points are still, according to at least the leaks that have been published, being negotiated. Like the framework for May and July, the current deal includes 3 phases. The first phase, which is the most important one that everyone is talking about, includes a 42-day truce in the Gaza Strip and has become known as the quote-unquote humanitarian phase, referring to the release of those hostages that have been defined in the humanitarian category. Within the humanitarian category are children under the age of 19, female civilians and female IDF soldiers who are held hostage, injured male hostages, as well as quote-unquote elderly male hostages over the age of 50. Back in May and July, there were 40 hostages that fit this category. However, since then, 33 remain in the Gaza Strip. The bodies of 7 of them have been recovered from the Gaza Strip, either after being executed by Hamas or being killed as a result of the ongoing military activity. As was agreed upon already in May and July, during this 42-day truce, there will be a substantial IDF redeployment in the Gaza Strip, a massive increase in the humanitarian aid that is entering into Gaza, although the exact quantities have not been published, and a substantial release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the release of each hostage. So those are the points that have been published with regards to what has been agreed upon in the first phase of the truce. However, there are some outstanding points in negotiations that are important to take note of. First, at this point, it is unknown how many of those hostages within the quote-unquote humanitarian category are in fact alive, and while in the past months Israel has demanded to receive a list of live hostages as part of the deal and has said that without receiving such a list, Israel will not go to any hostage deal, the country appears to have tacitly backtracked on that demand. No such list has been delivered. Because of this unknown, at this point it is also unclear which Palestinian prisoners will be released from Israeli prisons during the first phase, and how many of these prisoners will be released. If we go by the formula from the previous negotiation rounds of May and July, i.e. how many Palestinian prisoners will be released for each Israeli hostage, the number of Palestinian prisoners would exceed 1,300 prisoners that will be released during this first phase, including several hundred quote-unquote heavy Palestinian prisoners who are serving life sentences. However, it's also important to note that those negotiations in the past solely revolved around live hostages, and the bodies of hostages are, forgive me, but they are quote-unquote worth less when it comes to these equations of how many Palestinian prisoners will be released for the release of a hostage. Thus, because we don't know how many of those 33 hostages are alive, we don't exactly know how many Palestinian prisoners and which Palestinian prisoners are going to be released during this first phase of the deal. It has been leaked in different Saudi news outlets that Hamas tried to demand the return of the body of Yahya Sinwar, the former leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and then of the entire movement. However, that Israel rejected this demand in the first phase of the deal. A second important point relates to the IDF redeployment in the Gaza Strip. Here we have seemingly seen significant compromises both from Israel and from Hamas. Both Israel and Hamas already agreed in the previous rounds that the IDF would withdraw from the main Palestinian towns and populated areas during this first phase. However, there were vast disagreements with regards to several positions that the IDF would either hold or withdraw from. One of them is the Philadelphia axis, that is the border between Gaza and Egypt, and the other is the Netzarim corridor, that is the axis that the IDF has created separating northern Gaza from the rest of the Strip. According to what has been published, both sides compromised when it comes to the Philadelphia access, and in the first phase of the current deal, there will be a substantial reduction of the IDF presence along the Philadelphia access, but not a complete withdrawal. So until now, in previous negotiations, Israel said that it would absolutely not remove its troops from the Philadelphia lines, said that this will allow Hamas to completely rebuild. In turn, Hamas demanded a complete withdrawal of the IDF. According to what has been reported when it comes to the Philadelphia access, there's going to be a partial withdrawal of the IDF. When it comes to the Netzarim corridor, Israel appears to have compromised on this one, with reports stating that the IDF is preparing the complete evacuation of its outposts from the corridor, i.e. removing the buffer zone that it has created separating northern Gaza from the rest of the Strip. In turn, it has been reported that the IDF will maintain its presence along the buffer zone that the military has created in the Gaza Strip along the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel. This was not agreed upon in previous rounds, so that appears to be a Hamas compromise when it comes to the IDF redeployments. When it comes again to the compromise when it comes to redeployment, on the Philadelphia access, the military is going to have a partial withdrawal. The military appears to be preparing to evacuate the Netzarim corridor, but in turn, it is going to hold its positions along the buffer zone between Gaza and Israel. This issue of the IDF redeployment is closely associated with the third issue, which was a sticking point in previous rounds and led the negotiations to break down, which is the movement of Palestinian civilians back to northern Gaza. It's important to note that ever since the IDF created the Netzarim corridor, Palestinians were allowed to travel south in the Gaza Strip but could not return back to northern Gaza. In previous rounds, Israel had demanded that Palestinians traveling back to northern Gaza go through IDF checkpoints, i.e. those checkpoints along the Netzarim corridor, while Hamas in turn demanded a complete freedom of movement of Palestinians back to the northern parts of the Strip. According to what has been published, the compromise reached will be that the IDF is going to withdraw from the Netzarim corridor, as I mentioned above. However, in turn, the movement of Palestinians back to northern Gaza is going to be contingent on them passing through an international monitoring mechanism. This is something that Israel has demanded in order to ensure that armed militants don't return back to northern Gaza. It is important to note that at this point, it has not been published what that international monitoring mechanism is going to be, how long it's going to take to set it up, what's it going to include, who is going to have veto power in it, etc. There have been a lot of speculation, including that maybe U.S. private security companies, or the United Arab Emirates, or Gulf countries establishing checkpoints or things like that. Anything's possible at this point, still remains to be seen. Maybe this is still being negotiated, or simply has not been published. The final, and I would argue most important outstanding point, relates to the transition between the different phases of the deal. Now, why is this so important? Up until now in this video, I have discussed only phase 1 of the deal. However, phase 2 and phase 3, which are very closely intertwined, include an official end to the war and a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, a complete IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the release of all remaining live hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, and then the release of the bodies of all other hostages, and the rehabilitation and rebuilding of the Gaza Strip with massive international investment, a process that will require the removal of the Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip that was imposed prior to October 7th when Hamas was in control of the Strip. So, since phase 2 of the deal includes a complete ceasefire, an end to the war, and a complete IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the transition between the phases, between phase 1 and phase 2, is absolutely crucial to both sides in this negotiation. For Hamas, holding on to hostages is the only way that the group can hope to force an end to the war and IDF withdrawal, and thus in previous rounds the organization demanded that the truce that will be declared in phase 1 that will begin the release of hostages will automatically bleed into phase 2, and thus de facto from the moment there is a temporary truce declared in phase 1, this will be extended into a permanent ceasefire in phase 2, and the war will be effectively over before the group starts to release any hostages. In turn, Israel has declared that the destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities are two of the war's aims, among others, and the country therefore consistently demanded that the phases not be connected to one another, and that the fighting can resume after phase 1 until phase 2 can be negotiated. In other words, the sides agreed on what the phases are going to be. However, the transition from phase 1 to phase 2 has been one of the most important facets for both sides. Hamas has always demanded that the truce automatically be extended between phase 1 and phase 2, thus effectively the fighting ends when hostage release begins. In turn, Israel has always demanded that the phases not be connected to one another. First phase is a humanitarian phase, and then the fighting can resume until the second phase is negotiated. With regards to the current deal, it has thus far been reported that negotiations about the second phase are going to commence on day 16 of the first phase, i.e., we'll have the beginning of the first phase, and a little after 2 weeks, there will be a beginning of negotiations on how to implement the second phase. But it has not been reported what happens if the sides fail to reach an agreement with regards to that second phase, i.e., will fighting resume after 42 days, as Israel has demanded in previous rounds, or will the truce be automatically extended until the sides agree, as Hamas has demanded in previous rounds? This has not been reported in any Israeli news sites, in any Palestinian news sites, in news sites from the Middle East. Either the sides are simply being deliberately vague about this and not negotiating it, hoping that the sides work it out once phase one begins, or there is such a strict media blackout that we simply do not know. Either way, it is very important to note that this is possibly the most important facet when it comes to understanding the trajectory of the war. Are we seeing from when phase one begins that the fighting is over, and now it's a question of what is the quote-unquote day after plan, what's going to be in the Gaza Strip, or are we looking at another temporary truce that is going to be a little over a month and a half, and then fighting is going to resume? What will this mean for the rest of the hostages? What will this mean for the Gaza Strip? Everyone obviously is also waiting to see, once we're into the transition between phase 1 and 2, we're already going to be a month into the presidency of Donald Trump in the United States. Both sides are likely waiting to see how that's going to affect the situation. All this obviously remains to be seen. Before I conclude, on a personal note, I'm also going to say thanks to everyone who has sent messages and asked if everything's okay, since I've not uploaded many summaries lately. Everything's okay. I am simply dealing with a 6-week-old newborn and a toddler at home, and thus I have not been able to upload as many frequent summaries as I'd like. That is my brief highlight on the ongoing negotiation and possible hostage and truce deal between Israel and Hamas. If you find these reports informative, please do remember to hit that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, send them on to anyone who you think might be interested in updates on the war. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a visiting assistant professor and Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.